You often say VO2 max is one of the strongest predictors of longevity. What is VO2 max and why should we even care about it?
Our guest today is Brady Holmer, who is an endurance athlete, researcher, and exercise physiologist.
There were several studies that found an association between people with a higher VO2 max and lower rates of all-cause mortality.
He recently ran a 2-hour, 24-minute marathon using a low-mileage, high-efficiency training approach.
I passed out during a race, so I had to go get a cardiac stress test. They wanted to make sure that nothing was wrong with my heart, but they also measured my VO2 max during it. I think it was 76 or something.
We'll dive into his science-backed methods for incorporating Zone 2 and VO2 max training in daily life to enhance longevity and overall performance.
You can increase your VO2 max at age 40, at age 50, at age 60. If your VO2 max is below that, you're gonna have a hard time doing things in everyday life. Just getting out of a chair, walking to get groceries, carrying groceries in. 3 weeks of bed rest was worse for these men than 30 years of aging. To maintain your VO2 max, high intensity interval training is sort of a non-negotiable.
Can you talk about the importance of zone 2 training? By doing this workout, you can make your heart 20 years younger. Can you talk about that? Hello and welcome to the Compounding Project podcast, where we talk about taking small steps to become healthy, wealthy, and wise. I'm your host Satish Kajula, and this episode is all about health, especially longevity. With that, Brady, welcome to the show.
Satish, thank you for inviting me on. I'm happy to chat.
I'm going to dive right in. So before we hit record, we were talking about VO2 max a lot, right? So you also often talk about the importance of zone 2 and VO2 max training for longevity. And you often say VO2 max is one of the strongest predictors of longevity. So for somebody who has never heard of it before, so what is VO2 max and why should we even care about it?
VO2 max, it refers to the maximal rate of oxygen consumption by your body during whole body exercise. So that's kind of the exercise physiology definition of it. So I can obviously break that down into maybe terms that listeners might understand better. So when you are exercising, even when you're at rest, your body is using oxygen. So you breathe in oxygen to create ATP. That's kind of what we refer to as the energy currency of cells. Our body runs off of ATP. And it uses oxygen to do that. So when you start exercising heavy, your body uses more oxygen to create more ATP because you need more energy. And so maximal oxygen consumption, the most oxygen that your body can use at the highest effort, your VO2 max, that is what's referred to as your maximal cardiorespiratory fitness or maximal oxygen consumption. And how it's measured, usually people will have somebody get on a treadmill and basically run or walk at an increasingly faster speed and incline. So, up a steeper hill until you reach a point where you say, I can't go anymore. This is as hard as I can exercise. And during that test, they'll be measuring your oxygen consumption. And so look at the number at that point where you say, I can't go anymore. Whatever the rate of oxygen consumption is at that point, that's your VO2 max. So just to kind of like rephrase it, maybe, that the terms are kind of difficult, but it's the most oxygen, the fastest rate that your body can use oxygen to produce energy.
Interesting. Yeah, I recently did my VO2 max testing and it's not pleasant at all, right?
It is not. It's not a fun test to do.
All right, but I felt the numbers were very interesting. It's something that I can look at because I love data. I try to, because I'm an engineer by nature, right? I love data, so that's something that I want to measure every year because I heard the importance of VO2 max training, right? So we talked about like what is VO2 max, but can you explain like why is it important, right? Why should we even care about it, and why is it important for longevity?
Sure. Its emergence as a longevity marker is somewhat new. So for, VO2 max, the discovery of it, I guess, what we'll call it, is over 100 years old. So 100 years ago was kind of when the concept of VO2 max was first introduced. And so for, let's say, the first maybe 75 years or so of VO2 max, it was just known to be important for performance, for endurance exercise performance particularly. It's sort of one of these three major pillars of endurance performance. Athletes, marathon runners, Tour de France cyclists, they're going to have some of the top VO2 maxes ever because it is important for endurance performance. If you want to run long and you want to run fast, you have to be able to take in a lot of oxygen and turn that into energy. So some of the highest recorded ever VO2 maxes are among endurance runners, cyclists, and then cross-country skiers actually also have some of the highest VO2 max levels ever recorded. And so we know it is important. If you want to be an elite endurance athlete, you need to have a high VO2 max. It's sort of a prerequisite. You can't, unless you have a VO2 max above 70, you're probably not going to be winning the Boston Marathon or winning the Tour de France. It's just not going to happen. So it's important for endurance performance, but in, say, the last quarter century, last 25 years, there were several studies that found an association between people with a higher VO2 max and lower rates of all-cause mortality. I'm hesitant to say better longevity, so maybe they didn't necessarily like live longer, but they were at a lower risk for dying from any causes and cardiovascular disease or cancer or diabetes. So there was this association, and it's been repeated on across multiple studies and found across multiple studies. But people with a higher VO2 max have less all-cause mortality. They have lower risks of cardiovascular disease, and so it has really emerged. And I think emerged in the popular media space due to people like Peter Attia talking about it in his book. And I'd like to think maybe I play a part of it, but obviously he's on the New York Times bestselling list, and I'm not. So he clearly has a more important role to play there. But just podcasts in general have really made VO2 max emerge as this marker of longevity that people are aware of. And it kind of makes sense. And, maybe we can talk about the reasons why I think it's associated with longevity, but that's kind of the reason why it's central to this talk of longevity recently.
Yes, I think so. Before I hit record, we talked about like how I came to know about VO2 max was from reading Peter Attia's book Outlive, and then I've been following his stuff for a long time. But he often said muscle mass and or strength and VO2 max are one of the two best predictors of longevity, and then so let's talk about then the VO2 max, right? So can you tell me so now it's related to longevity. So how does it like decline with age, right? So can you talk about that concept?
Yeah, there's a pretty well-known and consistent decline in VO2 max with age. Like a lot of things, muscle mass, strength, they tend to decline with age on average. So if you look at some of these studies where they'll take groups of men and women and track them over several decades, you'll just see generally a linear decline starting at about age 40 or age 50, depending on whether you're looking at males or females. Starting, we'll just say at age 40, you just see this decline in VO2 max. It doesn't really stop. So about 10% per decade is sort of the number that is cited. And so that could be, depending on where your VO2 max starts, that could be anywhere from a half a milliliter per kilogram per minute to, up to 2 mLs per kg per minute. So 10% per decade is typically the decline. And what's interesting about that is, unfortunately, it seems to happen regardless of where you start. So if you look at trained males and females, people who are continuing to participate in endurance sports, or they're so-called masters athletes, these lifelong athletes, their VO2 max declines 10% per decade. So does that of sedentary people. But the key thing there is that the people who are active, they start at a higher baseline. So they start at, say, twice the VO2 max of somebody who's sedentary. So they really reach that point of frailty much, much, much later, if they ever reach it. And the one thing I like to point out, though, when talking about this is that does not mean, one, that the decline is inevitable, because this is on average, right? We're looking at population averages. But also, that doesn't mean you can't increase your VO2 max past age 40 or 50. Because if you're somebody who has really never engaged in structured exercise training, say your 20s and 30s, you didn't really do much exercise. And then you turn 40, you turn 50, you decide, I want to really focus on improving my VO2 max. Well, yeah, you can increase it. You can increase your VO2 max at age 40, at age 50, at age 60. It all depends on where you start. So somebody with a really, really high VO2 max, if you were an Olympic marathoner, maybe when you're age 50, you can't increase it because you were already super high. But you can increase your VO2 max at literally any age. I'm sure we'll talk about how to do that later in some of these interesting studies that do show that. But you can increase it at any age. You can prevent the decline by engaging in vigorous exercise training. But it's just to say that if you really don't, it's like if you don't use it, you lose it. If you don't take care of, do things to target your VO2 max, then it will decline around 10% per decade after that sort of age 40 to 50. But again, similar to muscle mass, if you are not resistance training, you're going to lose muscle mass. If you are, you're going to be able to maintain some of that.
We'll get back to the episode in just a few seconds. 94% of people who watch this channel haven't subscribed. If you're enjoying this episode, can you do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button? It helps the channel grow and brings in even more guests so that I can provide more value to you in the future episodes. Now, back to the episode. Yeah, I think that 10% but decline is something that actually made me thinking, because I did my calculation. Let's say for somebody who's at maybe who's age 40 and then his VO2 max is, let's say, like 40 mil per kg per minute, right? If it declines, like, if it doesn't do any training, let's say if it declines 10% per decade, which means like 40, maybe it becomes 35, becomes 30, and then 25, and then 20, right? So let's say, like, what happens, let's say if somebody is at a VO2 max of 20 mil per kg per minute. So what does that mean, in daily life? Like, can he do this regular, what do you call, like walking to a grocery store, or let's say like, walking up the stairs? So what does it translate to?
There is what is called, and it's referred to as this frailty threshold. So it's somewhere around between a VO2 max of 15 and 20 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That's sort of this frailty threshold. And below that, at the activities of daily living that you mentioned, walking to your car, walking upstairs. What's funny, we keep bringing up Peter Attia, but he's kind of the guy here, but he recently did a podcast where they were talking about the VO2 max that you need to engage in sexual intercourse. And it was like 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So he was like, you got to keep a high VO2 max so you can keep getting freaky, I guess. But so if your VO2 max is below that, you're going to have a hard time doing things in everyday life, just getting out of a chair, walking to get groceries, carrying groceries in. So once you reach that point, you lose your independence. You really are going to need help doing things in daily life. So what you want to do is prevent yourself from falling below that threshold for as long as possible. And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about on these athletes, starting with a high VO2 max. Because if you start, say you reach age 40 and your VO2 max is 65. Okay, so it declines 10% per decade. So by the time you're 80, your VO2 max is still going to be 30 to 35 mLs per kg per minute. When you're 90, it might dip below 30. And by the time, it would take you to age 120 if you actually wanted to reach that frailty threshold. So you're good to go. You're going to have a good VO2 max throughout life. But if you start at 40, and it declines 10% per decade, by the time you reach 70 to 80, you're going to be at 15 to 20 mLs per kg per minute. So you're going to have a fairly low VO2 max. Daily living, activities of daily living are going to become hard. So that's kind of the importance there. And you do need a minimum VO2 max to do basic activities of daily living. What I think that ignores then too, though, is that that's like the basic requisite to do general things, right? And a lot of people, I'm sure people listening to your podcast are like, well, I don't just want to be able to do activities of daily living. I want to exercise when I'm 70 and 80. I want to play outside with my grandkids. I want to run marathons. So if you want to do all those things, well, you need a much higher VO2 max. Build it up as much as possible early on. Do what you can to maintain it. That's kind of the takeaway there.
So Peter Attia, I mean, we keep bringing up his name a lot, but he says, he calls it like marginal decade. He asks people to actually list like 5 to 10 things that you want to do when you are maybe age 80, 90, or, even 100, right? And then reverse engineer, like, what can you do now, to be able to do that, when you are 80, 90 or 100. I love that. I even had my own list. I'm a big fan of pull-ups. I thought, okay, maybe I'll have to do at least one pull-up maybe when I'm 80, 90 or 100. So, you need to be doing certain number of pull-ups now to be able to do that later, right? Same analogy with, lifting kids, lifting your grandkids and stuff. So I think that's very good. Like, having a goal in mind and then working, what can you do now to be able to do what you want to do in the future, right? I love that. I love that analogy.
Right. Well, you talk so much about, offline about how you sometimes talk about money and finances on your podcast. Well, It's the same thing as okay, if you're saving for retirement, how much money do you want to have at age 90? Okay, well, how much money do you need now? If you want to have that much at age 90 and you're going to spend X per year, up until age 90, it's literally the same concept. Like all of these concepts kind of apply cross discipline.
I love that. Yeah, there are so many cross analogies like between fitness and money that it's like always like start
Investing.
early. Yeah, start early and then be consistent. You will be a millionaire and you'll also be healthy, right? So I love that. So let's see. No, we talked about VO2 max. So we also mentioned about two studies that I believe that are very important when it comes to you know cardiovascular fitness and also heart health. So one study was this Dallas bed rest study, which I found to be like very interesting. So can you talk about that study?
Yeah, the Dallas bed rest study. It was a study not led by, so currently, or the most recent iterations of the study, Dr. Benjamin Levine was one of the lead authors on there, but it was started over, I think it's over 50 years old at this point. This study started over 50 years ago. And what they did was they took a group of young men. I don't think it was many men, so small sample size here, but it's such a longitudinal study. They did so many measurements that it's really great to talk about. What they did was they measured the VO2 max and several other fitness related and health related parameters of these young men at baseline. And then they had them lay in a bed for 3 weeks, which sounds terrible to me. I don't think any amount of money could get me to lay in a bed for 3 weeks, but lay in a bed for 3 weeks, simulated bed rest. This is something that similarly happens to like if astronauts go to space, they're in zero gravity. So they couldn't even get up to go to the bathroom. They basically had, a urinal next to the bed and they would just, go to the bathroom there. So they laid in a bed for 3 weeks and they measured their VO2 max afterwards. And the numbers, I, can't cite the exact numbers right now, but their VO2 max, I think it, probably declined by like almost half of what it was at baseline. And then another interesting part of that study was that they trained them for a couple more weeks after the bed rest and it went back to normal. So it shows that 3 weeks of bed rest is terrible. Everything declines after that. No surprise, but you can easily train that back. Granted, these guys were in their 20s and 30s, pretty adaptable to training, but they engaged in a lot of high intensity training and their VO2 max came back to normal. So the more interesting part of this study, though, is that they followed these men over 30 years, 40 years, and I think that there was a study that came out a few years ago, 50th year follow-up of this study. But when they looked at so we'll go to the 30-year follow-up of this study, what the researchers found was that 3 weeks of bed rest was worse for these men than 30 years of aging. So their VO2 max declined more during that 3 weeks when they were lying in bed than it did from age 20 to age 50, which is just absolutely insane to me to think about. And it goes to show, I mean, it's a warning against inactivity, I think. Obviously, this was an extreme. Nope, most people aren't going to lay in bed for 3 weeks. I mean, some people might. If you get in an accident, if you have a very serious illness, I mean, something like COVID when we had the pandemic, I'm sure there were people in bed for 3 weeks, but it really just goes to show that your cardiovascular system and your capacity can decline rapidly with disuse. It can return to normal, but aging 30 years isn't even as bad as that. I think even the 40 and 50-year follow-up studies showed something similar where it was only at age, or the 50-year follow-ups, when these guys were 70, that's when it actually, their VO2 max was lower than it was after the 30 years of bed rest. So just a pretty cool study. And it's like, again, not that many people involved in it, but the fact that they followed these guys up for 30, 40, and 50 years is pretty cool. You rarely get that in physiology.
Yeah. I mean, all we could see is like, maybe they track people for like 8 weeks, right? 8 weeks or, a month or so. But again, like for 30 years, that's incredible. I mean, the first time I read about this experiment, this study, it was mind blowing. Right? And the second part where, they tracked for 30 years. So 3 weeks of bed rest, like if I will rephrase what he says, it's 3 weeks of bed rest is actually worse than 30 years of aging. That's incredible, right? And so, which is why, I mean, I always thought like being sedentary is not good for your body. I mean, I always have that in back of my mind, but I never thought how detrimental it is. Right now, actually, after I listened to that study, I did a few tweaks to my training as well. Like, I started backing down on my like deadlifts or squats because I don't want to get injured now, because if I get injured, right, I'll probably take some rest and then that will I know like what happens when I take that risk. So that's why I'm like more cautious now. So okay, and then anything on this study before we move on to the next study?
Yeah, not about the study in particular, but you did mention one thing that I think is interesting to note. So whenever you look at these studies, like the Dallas bed rest study or the studies that I mentioned before, when you see this sort of linear decline in VO2 max or muscle strength, it actually doesn't. That's what you see when you zoom out and see, look, on average, what happens. But when you really look at what happens when people age and when these declines happen, it's not really a straight down line, but it's like you go through these, they're called catabolic crises. So say you're, 50 and let's go back like 5 years, you get COVID and you are just in your bed for 2 weeks. Okay, well, that's when your VO2 max steeply drops down, your muscle mass steeply drops down, and then you kind of coast. Normally, maybe you're not losing anything for maybe a few years. Then something else happens. Maybe you break your leg, you get in a car accident. Oh, it goes steeply down again. So you kind of have these plateaus and these periods where if you're not doing anything, you're going to lose a lot. And then you might coast normally for a while. So it's not just like, oh, age 50 to age 80, straight down this hill. It's you go through these periods of extreme disuse. And when those happen, it's really hard to crawl back out of that hole unless you're really engaging in like vigorous exercise. So avoiding those at all costs, like you said, is probably the best thing. It's like don't get injured. If you're 30 or 40 years old, like do not get injured. Do not have a period of more than 3 to 4 weeks where you are not engaging in exercise, because you will lose a lot. And I think that's exacerbated at each decade of life. Like the older you get, the worse that those become, when you're 20, you can not do anything for a year and like you're going to be fine. But if you're 60 and you are in bed for 2 weeks, like you're going to lose a ton of muscle mass and just atrophy a lot.
For sure. I think it's compounding working against you, right? There is this curve, right? With your marginal decade, like, your health drops like significantly. That last 10, 20 years, right? It's not a linear decline, but just like you said, it's a compounding decline. All right. Yeah. So can we talk about the next study where, the study actually says, you can, by doing this workout, you can make your heart 20 years younger. So can you talk about that study by, I believe it's Ben Levine, if my notes are correct?
Yeah, Ben Levine did this study as well. His research group does a ton of research in the area of cardiovascular aging and just a lot of this seminal work and important studies. And what stands out about this one is that they took, I believe it was 70 or adults who were 70 years or older for this study, which is important because it goes back to what I was just saying earlier about most people kind of assume that you can't build strength when you're past age 60, or you can't increase your VO2 max past age 70. And so what they did in this study was they took a group of individuals who were 70 years old and they put them through, it was a pretty intense training protocol. So they did a couple high intensity training sessions per week, a couple zone 2 training sessions per week, and they also did some strength training. So it was pretty intense and it was progressive. But they did it for 2 years. So they kind of built them up. They did some base training. They had a really intensive period where they were doing, I think, a high intensity session twice a week. And then they dialed it down a little bit and kind of helped maintain that. But it was a 2-year exercise training protocol. And they found that they, improved their fitness. They improved some of the measures of their muscle strength. But one of the most important findings here, when they looked at the heart, they reduced some of these structural and functional, or improved some of these structural and functional measures of the heart, which they kind of equated to reducing the heart's age by around 20 years. Obviously, that's, you can't really measure the age of the heart, but if you compare the heart of somebody 20 years younger, it would look like the heart of these people who were 70 years old. And why is that important? So without going into like this really detailed lecture on cardiovascular physiology, Ben Levine, he talks about how after age 70, it actually almost is impossible to reverse these functional measures of the heart unless you engage in that high intensity exercise. So the heart, when we train it, becomes less stiff. We don't want a stiff heart. We want a heart that is very elastic. It can pump blood. Part of why we lose VO2 max as we age is because the heart becomes stiffer and our stroke volume, the amount of blood our heart can pump out per beat, it goes down. And that's one of the major causes of, or reasons why VO2 max declines with age. So if you can prevent that, that's good. But the older you get, the harder that is because the heart gets stiff. So you need to engage in high intensity training to do that. And that's why this protocol was so intense for these people 70 years or older. But it goes to show that, you are adaptable at that age, but it also goes to show that you have to do a little bit more intense work than people probably expect, or maybe than people want to do at that age.
Interesting study. I'm going to link that in the show notes as well. So you mentioned zone 2, right? So I believe zone 2 has been getting a lot of attention lately. I mean, thanks to all the podcasters and also researchers like you, right? So yeah, can you talk about like zone 2? I mean, we have mentioned VO2 max. So can you talk about like both, like what is zone 2 and then why is it important?
Yeah, sure. Zone 2, you could spend hours going over what a definition of zone 2 training is. I like to refer to it as just low to moderate intensity aerobic exercise because, the original definition, people may even be confused at what the heck's a zone. So in endurance training, when you're training for endurance, cycling, running, cross-country skiing, whatever, typically you prescribe training based on a 5-zone model or sometimes a 3-zone model, but in the 5-zone model is typically where the zone 2 comes from. So 1 is very light intensity, 2 is kind of low-ish still, but a little heavier intensity. Zone 3, you're getting into that moderate intensity effort. Zone 4 is kind of threshold effort, and then zone 5 would be VO2 max intensity. So zone 2, obviously, it's still kind of on that lower end, but almost creeping into that high intensity area. And so it's a low to moderate intensity exercise, and people can think of it as like the base training. So if they hear base training or, aerobic conditioning, that's kind of where zone 2 falls into, but it's used to refer to an exercise intensity. If you say I'm in zone 2, you're in this certain intensity of exercise, and you can measure it in many ways. Measuring blood lactate is the real way to measure zone 2. And lactate, again, trying to be like not go into so much detail here, but lactate, when we exercise or even at rest, our body produces lactate. And when we burn glucose for energy, lactate is a byproduct of that. It's not a waste product. People for a long time thought lactate was the thing that contributed to fatigue, contributed to that burning in your muscles. That's not really the case. Lactate is actually, our body can use that as a fuel. So we produce lactate when we burn glucose, but then our body can shuttle that lactate back to the muscles and use it as a fuel. But lactate levels, the harder you go, the harder your intensity of exercise, the more lactate you'll produce. And so for a zone 2 exercise, you want lactate to be at a sort of steady state. So when you go past a certain point during exercise, say you're in zone 3 or above, then you'll hit a point where your lactate levels, if you were to continuously measure them during exercise, they're just going to keep going up, because your body can't clear it out as fast as you're producing it. In zone 2, that is the point right before your lactate levels start to rise exponentially or increasingly. So if you looked at your lactate levels during zone 2, they should just be a flat line. Essentially, your body is producing lactate at the same rate that is clearing it out. Some people will cite certain levels that lactate needs to be at for zone 2. It's so individual that I don't really ascribe to that, and some people don't, some people do, but a 2 millimolar reading or below of lactate is typically what's considered to be zone 2. So that's how you really measure it. These days, you'll hear people say certain heart rate zones that are suggestive of zone 2, like 60 to 75% of your VO2 max. But again, that's going to be so individual from person to person. I think my zone 2 probably goes up to maybe 80, even 85% of my maximal heart rate. And some people's might, be less than 70%. So that's going to be individual, and which is why, unfortunately, the only way to really know your zone 2 is to test it. Not a lot of people will do that, hence why we estimate it using heart rate. But yeah, that's the short and sweet, maybe not so short, but the definition kind of zone 2. And when people hear that, that's typically what people are referring to.
Interesting. So yeah, I've recently done my VO2 max testing, and it also gave me like my zones, For some reason, it gave me like zones 1 to 4. I don't know why. It just had 4 zones, but I was able to know my zone 2 range. And based on that, I put that numbers in my Whoop, and then I'm able to train now. So can you talk about the benefits of zone 2 training before we move on to how can we increase our VO2 max? Like, what are the benefits? Like, why should we? Because for context, I always thought, I mean, there are so many people who think to be able to do cardio training, you just have to go all in every time. It has to be like high intensity, because on Instagram reels and on the social media, we see a lot of people like burning calories, sweating and doing hard stuff, and we get inspired, and then we do it, and that's what I thought. Like, that was the cardio training that I thought. Zone two is, it's not doing anything, right? But until I read your book and also did some research, there's so many benefits to zone two training. So can you talk about like the importance of zone two training?
There are definitely benefits. We'll talk about high intensity training. That's really the best way to improve your VO2 max, but zone 2 training is incredibly important for a lot of things. So, for one, it serves sort of as this foundation of, if we think of the exercise, your kind of fitness as like this pyramid where you need a strong base to sort of support the other work that you're going to do. So doing Zone 2 training, it builds your metabolic machinery up. It builds your aerobic base up. And when I refer to aerobic base, that kind of means a lot of things, but you're building more capillaries, you're building more blood vessels, you're building more mitochondria, you're conditioning your heart. You're providing your body with the foundation to sort of do these higher intensity efforts. You can get fitter, obviously, doing Zone 2 training too. It's not to say that it's useless for improving VO2 max, but your oxygen demand during it isn't quite that high to actually push your VO2 max up. But so it's important for, base building, serving the foundation. And that's why a lot of endurance runners, most of their exercise falls in that zone 2 training. If I looked at my own training, I think last week and most weeks, if I look at my breakdown of the heart rate zones that I'm in during a particular week, 65 to 75% of the time, probably even more, maybe up to 80%, is spent in zone 2, even 85%, I think. And I have about, 10% maybe in zone 3 or 4, and a fraction of a percent in zone 5 maybe. So the breakdown is pretty consistent. A lot of endurance runners, maybe people have heard of this 80-20 principle. I know it's going back to like this cross discipline. It's used in endurance training, but it's also used in like all these other areas of life too. I think they've co-opted it. So the 80-20 basically just refers to the idea 80% low intensity, 20% high intensity for training. And I think that works well for a lot of people. So zone 2 training, good for the foundation. But there are several physiological benefits to it too. So zone 2 training, typically it's a great way to put you kind of in that fat burning zone during exercise and improve your ability to burn fat. That's one of the benefits in improving mitochondrial function. Those are the two benefits you'll hear for zone 2 training. I and others, though, have somewhat pushed back against the idea that zone 2 is best for that, because if you look at some of the studies, high intensity training also seems to be better. It makes more mitochondria. It also improves your fat burning capacity, just as good as zone 2. But the thinking there is that you can't do high intensity all the time. You need to do some of this foundational, easier work. So that kind of is what I see the place for zone 2 being. And so, lots of benefits to it. Also, it's easy and it's enjoyable. High intensity, a lot of people enjoy it, but doing it all the time, it's not sustainable, and people may find it hard. A lot of people do find zone 2 intensity fun. You can put on a podcast, you can put on the compounding project in your ears, you can go out for a zone 2 run, and it's pretty enjoyable. Whereas, if you're doing a high intensity workout, it's enjoyable in a different way, but you're hurting.
I love that. I love that compounding for the plug in there for sure. Yeah. So you mentioned something very. I think it's foundational to my aerobic training. Look at so Peter talks about it a lot. Also, like look at cardiovascular fitness as a pyramid, like a triangle, and then our goal is to maximize the area of the triangle, right? I mean, you could have a wider base, but if you have a shorter peak, you won't have much area of the triangle. Similarly, like if you have a higher peak but a smaller base, of course, like you can't have a best pyramid. So the goal is to have the wider base and longer peak, so that you'll have maximize the area of the triangle, right? So now, so we'll talk about how to do VO2 max protocols, but I think zone 2 is something that I've never realized I was doing zone 2, but I recently incorporated some protocols of zone 2, right? So you mentioned lactate. I've never done my lactate measurement. I think it's not accessible to everyone, like not many people want to do it. So let's say if we want to go by like heart rates, right? And also maybe RPE, as the talk test that some people talk about. So how can we ensure that we're in zone 2, right? Can you talk about some heart rate monitors that we can use, and also maybe talk about like how we can do zone 2, like could be treadmill, rowing, stairmaster, and all that stuff.
For sure. Well, regarding the modality that you use, you can use whatever you want. Obviously, sometimes when I talk about it, I feel like I mentioned running too much because I myself am a runner, but running, stationary bike, bike outside, rowing machine, a ski erg machine, stair climber. It doesn't matter. Cardio is cardio, regardless of the modality you're doing it on. So find something you like and just do that. So that would be my number one thing. I'm, obviously biased for running, but running isn't for everybody. I think that the best thing is the indoor bike for a lot of people, because most people know how to ride a bike. They've done it and it can be fun. You can put something on the TV. It's like, it can be a great form of exercise. So modality doesn't matter. You can do zone 2 training on sort of anything. Regarding the ways to measure it, there are several different ways. So let's just throw lactate out. Most people aren't going to use it. Heck, I'm an endurance athlete. I don't even use lactate. It's costly. It's burdensome. Like, I'm just not going to do it. So heart rate is probably the main way. Pretty accessible. A lot of people have a fitness watch and it's going to measure your heart rate. My recommendation, though, if you're going to use heart rate, please just go and buy a heart rate monitor that is not on your wrist. Either buy a chest strap that will go right there. Some people like that. I have one. Some people find that it's kind of constricting because it can be kind of tight around your chest. And in that case, there are a lot of companies now that will make a armband that you can wear on your bicep. Those are accurate, not as accurate as the chest, but in my experience, a little more accurate than your wrist, because, just the wrist, if you're running fast, I guess if you're on a bike, it doesn't matter. But if you're outside running, the faster you go, the less accurate it becomes. So I would just buy heart rate monitors. Are cheap these days. It's $100 investment. And if you're someone really interested in doing this stuff and training on your heart rate, just invest in a heart rate monitor. That would be my number one recommendation. I don't have a preference for brands. Garmin, Polar, they all make these heart rate monitors. So invest in a heart rate monitor. That would be my number one suggestion. So how then you get your heart rate monitor? How do you measure whether you're in zone 2? I mentioned earlier, it's going to depend, a lot on individuals, on your training level, but generally between 60% and 75% of your predicted or measured maximal heart rate is going to be zone 2 intensity. So it's pretty wide range. And again, I'm not going to put like a specific beats per minute on there because everybody has a different maximal heart rate, but 60 to 70%, maybe 60 to 75% is kind of the heart rate zone that you are going to look for there. Another way to measure it, rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. There are a couple different scales. So sometimes people will see an RPE scale that goes from 6 to 20, which is kind of weird, but that scale was actually developed because if you look at that so let's say you have the scale from 6 to 20, it was supposed to correspond to heart rate actually. So if you're sitting at rest, you are supposed to say, oh, I'm at a 6 intensity right now. Put a 0 behind 6. Heart rate of 60. That's like a resting heart rate for most people. Well, if you're at maximal exercise, I'm at a 20, put a 0 behind the 20, that's 200. That's a maximal heart rate for a lot of people. So that scale was supposed to correspond to like people's heart rates when it was created, and that's sort of why it's there. But 1 to 10 is usually what most people are going to use, right? That's a lot easier. Most of us use a 1 to 10 scale. So I would say effort is a great way after you're pretty experienced to measure whether you're in zone 2 or not. And if you're going to use that, I would say an effort level of 5 to 7. 7's probably a bit too high. So 4 to 6 probably is going to be like your zone 2 rating of perceived exertion. Then once you're getting up to the 7, 8, 9, and 10, that's your zone 3, 4 and 5. So I would say your effort level 4 out of 6. But again, it takes some time for you to know what that is for yourself. RPE isn't, you just have to kind of learn your body and what that corresponds to for that to kind of be accurate. But effort level is great. My favorite way to measure it is the talk test though. So if you're in zone 2, you should be able to, say you're on a run or on a bike in the gym with your buddy. You should be able to have a conversation with them. You're going to be breathing hard, but you should be able to speak in 1 or 2 full sentences, not like you and I are doing right now, not, multiple sentences at a time, barely having to take a breath, but you should be able to talk to your friend next to you and hold a conversation. That's a good indication that you're in zone 2. If you can only speak in a couple words and then you have to take a breath, say a couple more words, then you're probably getting into that territory where you're above zone 2. It's honestly probably it's such a good indicator, I think, of whether you're in zone 2 or not. And if you don't want to do the talk test, you could kind of just use your breathing rate. Is your breathing relaxed? But it takes some effort. You're breathing in and out, but it takes some effort to breathe. Both of those correspond kind of to zone 2. But the talk test is such a good indicator. They've validated the talk test against lactate, against heart rate. So it's pretty reliable. And I would encourage a lot of people you can talk to yourself while you're exercising. And if you could hold a conversation with yourself, then you're probably in zone 2.
Yeah, love that. I mean, yeah, there was so much confusion for me when I first started my training, like zone 2 training. There's so much confusion on how to measure, how to know I'm in zone 2. But I think that the heart rate, like just like you said, I invested in a chest strap monitor. I have a Polar H10, no affiliation, but I really love that device. I have a Peloton bike, and then I love that the Peloton bike displays the heart rate on the screen. It displays the zones as well, and I love it. Like, I know that I'm in zone 2, and then sometimes I do talk tests just to make sure, like, I just talked with to my wife. I think that talk test is also important. It's not like in zone 1. If let's say if you're talking, about how is your day going and all that stuff, maybe you're potentially in zone 1. Versus, like, if you can't even make full sentences, you're not in zone 2. You're in like higher zones, right? I think that's good that you mentioned all about. So let's take an example. Let's say, did you have something to say?
No, I was just going to say, there was, just to illustrate kind of the confusion about zone 2, there was recently a paper that was published. They brought together, I think, like 15 to 20 experts, and they kind of came together and mentioned a lot of what I just mentioned on ways to measure zone 2. They sort of provided a list of, here's how you measure it with the talk test, the heart rate, lactate, RPE. The consensus was that these are great measures, but it was just funny reading that, because you're like, man, nobody can really agree on what zone 2 is, especially when it comes to lactate. That's why I just say it's not useless, but nobody can agree on what lactate level corresponds to zone 2. So all of these other measures, I think, are a lot better for that reason.
For sure. I think the key is to, like, just to start doing, right, instead of, like, spending too much time on what exactly is my zone 2, right? Just like come up with a number. I think there is something like this 220 minus your age for determining your max heart rate, right? So let's say, like, and take my example, right? First, let's say if I want to start my zone 2 training based on heart rate, and then so my age is like 35. So how can I calculate my zone 2, let's say like 60 to 75% of max heart rate?
Yeah, so you said you're 35, so 220 yes. minus your age, that would put you at 185 for a max heart rate. Yep. And then, you could just multiply that by 0.6 and then multiply that by 0.75, and then you would be able to get your range there. I'm not going to do that math in my head live, because I'll probably make a mistake, but yours is, similar. I'm 32. So, my age predicted maximal heart rate would be 188, and that's pretty close. I will note that, that's the formula will work for some people. It won't work for a lot of people. So, I mean, that predicts me at 188. My actual max heart rate is 186. So it's pretty accurate, but there are some people, I intrinsically and just forever have had a lower maximal and resting heart rate. There are some people who are 40 years old and they can reach 200 maximal heart rate, whereas I've never seen a 200 maximal heart rate ever, and I'm just not going to be able to get there. So if people don't know what their max heart rate is, and you probably got one though when you did your VO2 max test, did they tell you what your max heart rate was?
Yes. So that, which is why I wanted to bring this conversation. So my based on my age, it's like 185 beats per minute is my max heart rate. So when I did my VO2 max test, it was 183 beats per minute.
Okay.
So it's almost like closer to what this formula said. But again, I don't think we don't want listeners to spend too much time, looking for the perfect number. Instead, like, just try to calculate based on what's out there, and then start, and then update based on how you feel, how you talk, and then that's how you modify your training. So one other question that I had on the zone 2 was, so isn't just zone 2 enough, or why do we need like a VO2 max training? I know that's not enjoyable. I don't look forward to my VO2 max trainings, but I can do 4 zone 2 sessions per week. Isn't that enough? Like, why should I incorporate a VO2 max training?
Yeah, obviously, doing 3, 4, or 5 zone 2 sessions per week is great. That's what I do also. But if you're somebody who is wanting to increase your VO2 max, and going back to this discussion on aging, to maintain your VO2 max, high intensity interval training is sort of a non-negotiable. And that's just because, going back to the whole physiology of it, if you want to raise your ceiling higher, you got to force your body to, you got to increase your oxygen demand during exercise, to force your heart to pump harder, to force your body to deliver more oxygen to those muscles so it can adapt and increase that ceiling, which is, your VO2 max. So again, this isn't to say, you're going to do HIIT every day, but once minimum, maybe twice per week, if somebody focused on this, increasing your VO2 max, probably, necessary. You just have to do some type of high intensity interval training. Importantly, though, that doesn't mean going all out to 2 times per week. High intensity training pretty much refers to anything of, 85% of your maximal heart rate or above. That would all be considered high intensity training. So it can be so-called tempo work, which it's hard, but it can be fairly comfortable. You're not able to do the talk test. You're only able to speak a few words at a time, but you could do it for 20 to 30 minutes at a time. Runners will often do things called tempo runs where, yeah, it's not that easy to sustain, but you can keep running at it and you're like, okay, this feels fine. It's not bad. I would consider it like if somebody were going to run a marathon, it's like your marathon race pace. It hurts, but you do it for several hours at a time. So it's obviously not unsustainable, but you're not in zone 2 during a marathon, or if you're racing, you shouldn't be in zone 2, I guess. Hopefully not. So yeah, that's the importance of it. And, multiple studies will just show, it's unequivocal that comparing moderate intensity or low intensity training to high intensity training, it's better at improving your VO2 max. You need the zone 2 intensity to support that, but the high intensity training is really what bumps that number up and helps you maintain that. I think the older that one gets, if you are wanting to maintain VO2 max, that high intensity training at least once a week becomes almost mandatory to do that.
And also, like, there's data to back that up, right? Combining zone 2 training with a high intensity training will actually improve your cardiovascular fitness.
Yeah, combining it, especially for people, if you're training for a certain performance goal, obviously like running a marathon, combining the two is best. But to be honest, there are just, you can increase your VO2 max without combining them. And I'm not sure, I think combining the two would obviously be better because you're building that aerobic base and then doing the high intensity training. But several studies, just do HIIT 2 to 3 times a week, take people who are untrained, and you're going to increase your VO2 max. But people will say that, that's not maybe something that you want to do long term. And I would agree that it's better to do a combination of the two.
Exactly. Like, yeah, I definitely don't want to do like at least 3 to 4 HIIT sessions per week. I don't look forward to that at all.
No, me either. And I don't know that, the studies obviously don't last that long. The studies are 8 to 12 weeks long and then people stop. So I don't know anybody doing just plain high intensity sessions every day and just doing that. It's, I argue sometimes against the fact that it's not sustainable, but clearly like nobody wants to do that.
For sure. All right. So I think so you mentioned VO2 max is the greatest predictor of longevity. And we talked about zone 2, we talked about VO2 max, like HIIT trainings and stuff. So for somebody, let's get into the actual like training protocols. Like, for some, let's take 3 people, like, a beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So let's start with a beginner. So for a beginner, maybe who doesn't have much time to dedicate to cardiovascular training, right? Maybe he's doing 2 to 3 strength training sessions per week, and he has maybe 3 to 4 hours that he can dedicate to cardiovascular training. So how can he structure his week if he has like 3 to 4 hours when it comes to this VO2 max training?
Yeah, for a beginner, I would say you're going to want to do. Let's just say you are going to do three endurance focused or 3 aerobic cardio, whatever you want to call it, sessions per week. I would say 2 of those should be lower intensity sessions. 1 of those should be a high intensity session. For the low intensity session, 45 to 60 minutes long. And for there, you don't really need, protocol really isn't, maybe the right word, because for those, it's just 45 to 60 minutes. Just go out and, exercise. Just do your zone 2, steady state, get on the bike or whatever, do it for 45 to 60 minutes and you're done. I would do 2 of those sessions a week, and then I would do 1 high intensity interval session. And there are so many variations of high intensity intervals that, we could obviously do a whole another podcast on that. But generally what I say is, you want to do intervals that are 1 minute to 4 minutes long and make your rest or your recovery period equal to or half of the hard portion of your interval. So let's just use an example. Somebody's going to do 1 minute hard and either 30 seconds to a minute of recovery, and then you're going to repeat that. Let's say you repeat that 10 to 12 times. You do a 20-minute warm up, you do a 20-minute cool down where you're just doing light intensity exercise. Boom, there's your interval workout. 1 to 4 minutes, that's kind of the sweet spot when it comes to VO2 max. There's no optimal length of interval that is going to maximally improve your VO2 max. But obviously, if you're going for 1 minute, you can go a bit harder. 4 minutes, you can't go quite as hard. But I would keep that interval length 1 to 4 minutes. Any shorter than a minute, it kind of becomes like sprint interval training. Any longer than 4 minutes, you might find that hard to kind of keep the intensity up, especially for this like beginner that we're talking about. So yeah, find intervals 1 to 4 minutes long. Do, depending on the length of them, 4 up to 12 intervals. Do your recovery in between and put a warm up and cool down on either side of that. So that I think would be an optimal structured week for some beginner.
All right. Yeah, I have a few questions on this one. So this person can do like 3 sessions per week, and you mentioned 2 low intensity and then 1 HIIT, right? So when it comes to low intensity, so 45 minutes to 60 minutes, right? So in zone 2. So does it mean, okay, let's say, it is including warm up, let's say, maybe 10 minutes of warm up and then 35 minutes of zone 2, or it's just like 10 minutes of warm up and then 45 minutes of zone 2 where actually.
No, yeah, for the zone 2 sessions, if you're going to do a warm up, you just include that in there. So I mean, the warm up is basically just part of your exercise. Just start, go for 45 minutes and stop. For if you're not doing really high intensity, you don't really need a warm up. Maybe do some stretching, maybe do some, mobility drills or whatever. But for me, so say if I'm going out for an hour long run, I'm not going to do a warm up before that and then stop and then do my run. I'm just going to head out the door. My body's going to warm up naturally, and then I'm going to stop. Part of what keeps that run kind of easy is the fact that I have to go slow at the beginning because I am warming up. I just got out of bed like an hour ago. So yeah, just build a warm up into that 60 minutes. You don't need to do a warm up in addition to that.
All right. And the second question is, let's say, I sometimes, I enjoy playing pickleball also, right? And then, so pickleball, like when I play for, let's say, for a couple hours, and then if I wear a Whoop, right? So after my session is done, my pickleball session is done, it gives me some analysis as to, okay, you're in zone 2 for, let's say, 45 minutes, you're in zone 3 for 10 minutes and all these different zones, but I'm not in that zone 2 for 45 minutes straight. I'm going between zones, let's say 2 and 5, and does that really count? Or or on my Peloton, if I'm in zone 2, I know I'm in zone 2 for 45 minutes straight. So does it have to be continuous, like in this zone 2?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because a lot of people will say, oh, if I go out for maybe a 2-hour bike ride, but I go up a hill or something and I get into zone 3 for a little bit and then I come back down into zone 2. The short answer is yes. It does not have to be continuous. If you go out for a 2-hour ride and you spend 20 minutes in zone 3 and an hour and 40 minutes in zone 2, you did an hour 40 minutes of zone 2 exercise. So with your pickleball thing, yes, that's you probably got 2 hours of zone 2 exercise during that, even though you had those little brief periods of higher intensity kind of interspersed within there. So yeah, totally. I mean, that's a great way to, and I think something I didn't mention, again, when I talk about this stuff, I'm obviously biased towards like endurance sports, but if you go and play basketball or pickleball for a couple hours, that could be your endurance training session for the week. And that counts just as much if you're in the zone 2 heart rate kind of range during that.
Yep. Yeah. Love that. Love that. The second question is regarding the HIIT protocol. So something you mentioned, like 1 to 4 minutes. So you also talk a lot about Norwegian 4x4 and Rhonda Patrick, who I've been following for a long time. She also talks about Tabata workouts, 10 by 1. I believe. So can you talk about those training modalities or protocols, for HIIT?
Yeah, both of those are great. I think the Norwegian one, it's often cited so much, and Rhonda talks about it so much because it is one of the most research-backed methods. I hesitate to say it's the optimal protocol, but so many research studies have used it that I just think it's a great, yeah, this is great. We know it improves VO2 max. We know it improves heart health, as shown by some of those studies with Ben Levine. So it's not the quote unquote optimal protocol because anything can be great, but it is validated by the research. And what that one involves, for people who may not know, it's basically you're doing 4 minutes hard, a total of 4 times. And between those 4 in-minute intervals, you're doing 3 minutes of easy recovery. And again, this could be running, this could be climbing upstairs, this could be on a bike, this could be on one of those assault bikes where you're kind of moving your hands back and forth. So that's that protocol. It's great. It doesn't take that long. Again, it's like 16 and an extra 9 minutes. It's 25 minutes long. You do a warm-up cool down, so it's pretty short. And then Tabata is great too. Again, another one of those where maybe it's not the optimal, but it's been so well studied, this Tabata protocol, it's pretty well evidenced. But that one really sucks, because it's hard. You have to go, I believe it is 20 seconds hard, 20 seconds easy. You repeat that 8 times, and then It's crazy because the original protocol, if you go back and read that study, they did 20 minutes hard or 20 seconds hard, 20 minutes easy, repeated 8 times. And then they did that 4 times, 4 total times. So they did 32 total intervals, but a lot of the ones now are just, you just do eight reps of it and you're done. So the original protocol, you read that, you're like, oh my God, that sounds terrible. And it is all out because you're only going for 20 seconds. So if you're not going as hard as you can for those 20 seconds, it's not really true Tabata. I think what's great about those two protocols is depending on the mood that you're in and depending on what type of person you are, you might like one of those better. So for me, the 4x4 sounds great. I love kind of the effort of a 4-minute interval, the intensity of it. Whereas the 20 hard, all I can put out for 20 seconds, that sounds terrible. But some people like that. Some people, it's over in, less than 10 minutes. It's a less than 10-minute protocol for the Tabata. So it's really time efficient, but you have to work your butt off for the entire time.
For sure, I'm leaning towards 4x4 as well because I look forward to that 4 minute or maybe 3 minute recovery.
Yeah, the recovery period. Yeah,
because especially for Tabata, the 10 seconds, it feels like a blink of an eye. That 10
Oh yeah,
seconds or 20 seconds of
you
rest.
barely have time to slow down before you just have to pick up the pace again.
Exactly. So yeah, now we talked about beginner. Maybe let's talk about intermediate, right? So he has some more time to dedicate for cardio training. Let's say he has maybe 3 to 5 hours that he can dedicate. So how can he modify his training protocol when it comes to zone 2 and VO2 max?
I would say for that person, just add another zone 2 training session during the week, to be honest. And what I would do then is make that zone 2 training. So the beginner, we're kind of just focusing on like getting into it, getting in like the endurance work. For this next person, I would say take the protocol that we just listed for the beginner, 45 to 60 minutes twice a week, the high intensity session twice a week. And then on the weekend, I would include a longer zone 2 session, say 80 to 90 minutes. Go out and do a hike, go out and do a longer, bike ride or something like that. And this is going to be easier, a little bit easier though than those other 2 zone sessions. So like upper end of zone 2 maybe versus lower end of zone 2, but go for a really long kind of endurance, a true endurance session on the weekend. So a hike, bike ride, something like that. Something that takes like 90 minutes, maybe even 2 hours, but it's very, very, very leisurely.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on to advanced person, right? So he has maybe 5 to 7 hours or more than like 7+ hours dedicated for cardiovascular fitness training. And so how can he modify his training protocol?
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of keep leveling up. So take the protocol that I just said for the intermediate person. So you have those 2 zone 2 sessions, your high intensity session, your very long kind of endurance session on the weekend. And then I would add one more higher intensity session to that week. But this one is going to be a little more in that tempo range. So it's going to be like a zone 3. So the high intensity session I mentioned before, maybe that's going to be a zone 4 or 5. You're doing a Tabata, you're doing a 4x4, you're doing 1 minute hard, 1 minute easy. This extra session that you add on, do something 20 to 30 minutes long, but it's sustained, but you can, it's hard, but it's sustainable. So a tempo run or a tempo bike ride, you're getting on and riding for 20 to 30 minutes. It's pretty hard. You're breathing hard. You could speak in sentences, but it's kind of effortful. That's another session that I would add during that week. So you're doing 2 higher intensity, but they're not 2 all out sessions. You're getting an easier high intensity. I know that's kind of a weird phrase to use, but that would be my recommendation there. That protocol is going to sort of mirror like a protocol of like an endurance athlete almost. Maybe you're not doing quite the volume of a high level endurance athlete, but you're doing basically the structure. A lot of endurance training structure is 3-4 zone 2 sessions per week, 2 high intensity sessions, and then a really long workout.
Love that. I love that this is simple. I mean, not simple, I would say, but at least like actionable advice that our listeners can find it useful. So one thing I actually did not bring it up, maybe I should have brought it up earlier, is like your VO2 max number. I think most people would be curious, to be able to run 2 hours 24 minutes Boston Marathon. What VO2 max would it take, or what is your VO2 max if you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I've had it tested several times, probably 3 or 4 times, like, throughout my entire life, and all of the tests have been somewhere between 75 and 80 mLs per kg per minute. I remember I have data when I was 16, I think, 16 years old. I passed out during a race I was doing track, so I had to go get a cardiac stress test. They wanted to make sure that nothing was wrong with my heart, and so I did a stress test, but they also measured my VO2 max during it, and I think it was 76 or something, 73 maybe when I was 16 years old. So I haven't even increased it that much since 16, but it's always just been naturally high. But yeah, the highest I've seen is 80. I saw 80 on one test, but 75, 80, somewhere in between that range, I think.
Wow. I think, yeah, for context, I think for to be in the elite range in your age group, is it 53 plus?
I think 53 plus. Yeah, yeah. Typically well above average is 53, and then typically they'll categorize like the endurance athletes are going to be like 65 or above or something like that.
Okay. Wow. That's incredible. I mean, I think people who know the importance of VO2 max training and also that number can only appreciate what a 70 plus mil per kg per minute would mean, right? I love that. I mean, like that's really commendable. All right, so we're getting towards the end of the podcast. There are three questions that I ask all my guests. I call them the hot seat questions. Are you ready for this?
Sure, let's do it.
The first question is regarding action, right? So, what small action would you recommend people take right after listening to this conversation?
First thing that they should do, I think if you currently aren't doing it, I would say make sure you're doing one, I'll call it an extra long workout every single week. We're going back to the protocol that we talked about. I just think that it is so important to at least once a week head outside, run, bike, whatever, go for a couple hours. Just let your body do what kind of it was meant to do, is move. Movement is obviously important, but oftentimes we're strapped for time. But those long endurance sessions, great for forming that aerobic base, just great for your metabolism, great for your mitochondria. And it can also be kind of this mental health break as well. Just 2 hours, put on an audiobook, go with your partner, and make time for that during your week.
Love that. Love that. So the second question is regarding books. I know you are a big researcher, and then so what three books or at least three papers since you're into research would you recommend people read for health and longevity?
That's a great question, because I feel like I've read so much. We've mentioned obviously Peter Attia, but his book Outlive is really great, and I think that it can be pretty technical, but there's a lot of actionable information in there, which I think is good. I know a lot of people aren't going to go and read research papers, but the title of his research paper is blanking on me right now. But there are papers by Dr. Michael Joyner where he kind of discusses. He's a physiologist, kind of very well known in the realm of physiology, but where he kind of talks about the pillars of endurance performance. And maybe if you want to put a link to that in the show notes, I can send it to you after we're done. But he talks about the pillars of endurance performance and why they're important. And it's just kind of interesting historical perspective on that, which I think is probably valuable for a lot of people to read. And then I'll say something kind of not scientific, but there's a book by Haruki Murakami called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And even if you're not a runner, I think it's a great book because, there's, I don't know, maybe a little bit about science and health in there, but he really kind of just talks about, it's like more of a philosophical take on running and exercise and the importance of it. And I would recommend a lot of people read that. It's one of my favorite books.
All right, yeah, I'm going to link all of them in the show notes and also a plug-in for your book also. That's how I got to know about you. So VO2 Max Essentials. So can you talk about your book?
Yeah, VO2 Max Essentials. This book kind of arose. It's self-published, so I self-published it. I just put it together and published it on Amazon. But it came about after I published a series of blog posts on VO2 Max. I sort of did a series on what is VO2 Max, why is it important with aging, what's its association with longevity, how can you improve VO2 Max, what happens to VO2 Max as you get older. I did a series of blog posts, and I just decided to put that together in a book called VO2 Max Essentials, as you mentioned. It's pretty much just I would say it's a beginner's guide. There's some technical stuff in there, but a beginner's guide to VO2 Max. What is it? what's the science behind it, and how to improve it. It does have some protocols in there. So it is, it's not the, my life's work, but it is a very interesting book, and the feedback on it has been great. Anybody who's bought it and read it has said they found some value in it. And I think that if people are interested in what we talked about today and maybe even want a deeper dive into the physiology of VO2 Max, that they would find that very interesting. And they can get that on Amazon. It's available as a hardcover, paperback, Kindle as well. And then there's an ebook as well. I saw it on Gumroad. You can download like the PDF or the EPUB, but Amazon's probably the best place to get it if people are interested.
Yep. Yeah, I found it valuable also. I even got my training protocols from that book. So that was helpful. And the last question, so what is your favorite health hack?
That may be surprising, but lately I think my favorite health hack has just been going on walks. I know walking is very popular lately. I don't think it's the best thing to improve your fitness, but just the mental space that I get when I go for a walk, it allows me time to, read a book, or heck, even with our iPhone technology these days, we can do work while we're on a walk. Maybe not the optimal thing, but you can multitask, which is great. I just think I do a couple walks per day, even on top of whatever exercise that I'm doing. Several benefits, not just for metabolism, but just to get outside and give your legs a rest. I think it's been, I wish I realized how good they were for recovery and things like that before, but that's my favorite health hack these days, just going on a couple 20 to 30 minute walks every day.
Love that. Thanks a lot for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How can people learn more about you?
I am most active on X. People can find me at _Holmer, just like my last name, Holmer. And then if they want to sign up for my newsletter, I write a weekly newsletter on Substack called Physiologically Speaking. So if they go to physiologicallyspeaking.com, you can sign up for the newsletter. It's free. I sometimes post more than once a week. So every Friday is a newsletter. It's on a science study that I find interesting. But I'll also post maybe occasionally a couple extra times per week, just if the spirit moves me, I guess you should say, if I find something interesting I want to write about or talk about. And yeah, it is free. You can obviously pay if you want to help support me and get some of the premium content that I occasionally put out. But those two places are probably the best place. I do post on Instagram occasionally, but I'm not too active on there. So
great. I'm going to link all of them in the show notes. With that, Brady, thanks for being on the show.
Satish, this was great. Thanks so much for inviting me. I had a great time.
All right, great. If you found value in this episode, then please don't forget to subscribe to Compounding Project Podcast. This will help me get more guests so that I can bring more value to you in the future episodes. Until next time, trust compounding and take action now. Thank you so much for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this episode, can you do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button? If you like this episode, then you might enjoy this episode, which links in with some of the stuff we talked today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.